Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hi, welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is hannahstohelit. I am a moderator, and I am here to kind of flip the script so that one of our usual podcast hosts, Jeremy Salkeld, aka EnclavedMicrostate, can talk a little bit about something that isn't quite history, but for April Fools is instead a hoax that we find particularly interesting. He finds particularly interesting, which is Tartaria. And Jeremy, do you mind telling us a little bit more about it before we jump in and discuss it more?
Sure. So Tartaria who even knows how it's pronounced, is one of those weird conspiracy theories that really popped up very recently, that asserts basically that the wool has been pulled over our eyes with regard to an entire period of history in an entire region of the world. In its simplest, shortest form, it is basically the idea that there was at one time a Tartarian empire of indeterminate scope, but which usually is said to include most of northern Asia. At more extreme ends, Tartaria supposedly ruled the entire world, or just had so much cultural influence that everyone copied it. But that really undersells the scale of the madness, because in some ways that is only one dimension of it. The other two are A, that Tartaria supposedly possessed extremely advanced technology, which is often referred to as antiquitech, and secondly, that the fall of Tartaria is attributable to an event known as a global mud flood, in which, well, basically, mud suddenly emerges from nowhere and literally raises ground level by anywhere from a few feet to sort of the height of entire buildings, and thus buried Tartarian civilization, and also large parts of the rest of the world too. And that's the short version.
Wow, so I have about 6 different questions now. I guess the first question is, so when they frame this as a historical reality or based on a historical event, and then it's been forgotten, what exactly is the quote-unquote historical context here? When are they claiming that this happened? What kind of historical proof texts or so on do they ascribe to the theory or the existence of Tartaria?
So I think the thing to note with Tartaria is that people who advocate it will disagree on the most minor of details. And they will also disagree on the most major of details, including when was this thing in existence. You mentioned the proof, though, and that's where it gets kind of interesting. Because it's not like Tartaria is a word they made up. Tartaria/Tartaria, if you want to pronounce it sort of classical Latin-wise, was a term used to refer to a broad region which we might call Central and Inner Asia. So basically, modern Central Asia, aka the Stans minus Pakistan, so Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, that region, Mongolia, and Siberia. And also sometimes Tibet and Manchuria/Northeast China/the Northeast. All of that was considered Tartaria because it was the lands of the Tartars. It usually wasn't referred to as a single country, because it wasn't. Very occasionally it was, but that's in late medieval texts that use Tartar as a synonym for the Mongols, which gets kind of into why this designation exists. Tartar and Mongol were used pretty interchangeably. In fact, for a while, Tartar was used more often than Mongol. And so, in a sense, Tartaria advocates are not wrong that there was once a very large empire that included Mongolia and Central Asia, but that's because it was the Mongol Empire. And later maps and texts that talk about Tartaria are actually referring to a broad region that used to be part of the Mongol Empire, but which, because most of these people are from Western Europe and both not particularly interested and not particularly proximate, they don't have either the inclination or the means to really talk about the specifics of where different polities begin and end within that environment. Which, in order to loop back round to roughly when we're talking about, we're talking, let's say, sometime from usually the 15th through to the very early 19th centuries, in terms of the actual material that discusses quote unquote Tartaria as a generic region without much specific detail.
So when people who subscribe to, the Tartaria myth, I suppose, so when they are stating that, this is a place that really existed, which, it was, but not in the way that they're thinking, and then they discuss it. So what kind of, I guess, society or civilization are they describing? What exactly is it that makes the Tartaria of their beliefs and ideas different than the one that actually exists? And what, especially given how, relatively recent the dates you just gave us are, why do they claim that this is something that was able to be hidden up so well?
So, there are all manner of different explanations given. There is a certain extent to which I think the reason that people are able to talk about Tartaria so supposedly definitively is because they have this notional sense that all human societies are pretty similar in terms of lifestyle. And why, if there are sort of substantial human remains of sort of large cities in the Mississippi Valley and in Mesopotamia, are there none before the medieval period, in their views anyway, in large parts of Central and Eurasia? And the answer pretty much is that they don't really understand the pastoral nomadism, where essentially societies are not necessarily on the move across large distances, but certainly move between areas of pasturage and don't have substantial permanent settlement, was a pretty common lifestyle in the Eurasian continent. Indeed, to some extent, still is. And so they presume that any kind of political formation, state formation, must be a sedentary state capable of producing large monumental architecture. And that, I mean, that just is not correct to how early modern Central Asians lived for the most part. Yes, there were large cities, places like Bukhara and Khiva, that were very substantial and actually very old. But the places that Tartaria advocates are talking about are areas of arid grassland that are not suitable for long-term habitation before combustion engines make it easy to move stuff long distances. But it's interesting you raise the point about the cover-up because, as noted, a large part of this cover-up is literal. Like, there is, for some reason, the assertion, I say for some reason, though actually we can go into how Tartaria came about as an idea, but there is this assertion that ground level on Earth literally just rose at some stage. There was a global mud flood that buried Tartarian civilization, is one view. Another is that there is some kind of deliberate obfuscation by them with a capital T, but who they are will depend. Like, some people say it was the Soviet Union which had conquered Tartaria, unless of course it was the Russians who'd conquered Tartaria, but they can't decide. Either Russia or the Soviet Union, but mostly the Soviet Union, deliberately trying to erase Tartaria in order to sort of justify its own national policy and split up the Central Asian peoples, or it involves the CIA trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. Why, of course, if it's one particular side in the Cold War that was doing this, the other side didn't supposedly mention the truth of Tartaria as a counter strategy, is anyone's guess. But in many ways, it's not unlike most conspiracy theories in asserting the existence of a deliberate kind of media human cover up. It's more weird in that it asserts that there's also a literal geological cover up involved.
Yeah, so that's what I find so interesting, in that like my first thought from that honestly is if Tartaria was covered up in this mud flood, but so was the rest of the world, does that mean that they're implying that other archaeological or like dating of different societies based on how I guess deep they are underground, when they're is that something that is part of their belief system? Other question, you kind of were leading into it, like I guess the question of where this belief came from and why people believe in it, what kinds of people believe in it, is definitely something that I'm now wondering, especially since you mentioned specifically like the Soviet Union, and this does seem to kind of be a conspiracy theory. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the impression I'm getting from the discussion is that it's one that seems to center more on, Asia, Eurasia, or something like that.
Actually, your two questions are pretty closely linked, because Tartaria comes after the mud flood theory, basically. There is the exact history of this I have found hard to get into, in part because by the time I first started looking into it, one of the major websites hosting the stuff got taken down. In fact, I had kind of stumbled onto it after the takedown, and there was a lot of outrage by people who were advocates of the conspiracy theories. There was a website called stolenhistory.org, which was basically a huge treasure trove of pseudo history stuff. And one of its big things was the idea of the cultural layer, i.e., that for some reason there is an entire layer of stuff under modern cities that has been buried by a rather sudden cataclysmic introduction of material that raised ground level, but everyone decided to keep the buildings where they were and just move the doors up. In essence, if you have ever lived anywhere that has windows that are sort of below road level, so I mean, you'll see this in cities like London, for instance, where you kind of have external stairs to get down to a basement. Like cultural layer advocates will assert that actually, when the buildings were built, these windows were at ground level, but then ground level moved up. Which, like, again, you can kind of see where the kernel of truth is. Lots of really old cities are built on top of earlier versions of the same city. It's why, like, people will find interesting Roman artifacts in their basements in Rome or London or wherever. Because, yeah, if you live on top of an old Roman or Greek or Celtic town, you'll find stuff when you dig down and build new stuff, because the city is built literally on top of rubble. But that's very different from saying that a modern building built, I say modern, but even then, mid 1800s building was somehow built at ground level, and then 3 feet of earth were then piled up in front of it, and instead of digging it away, they just paved a new road on top of it. The reason this kind of gets into Tartaria is that Tartaria seems to have been introduced to cultural layer. I don't exactly know how, but at some stage in early 2017, it seems like people on the Stolen History forum and also on the Cultural Layer subreddit started talking about this conspiracy theory they had discovered on the Russian internet about the existence of a large empire called Tartaria. And it seems like the reason that Tartaria got associated with the mud flood is that basically the mud flood was given as an explanation for why Tartaria collapsed.
You say 2017, is the implication that that link was only made in 2017, or that when they discovered this on the Russian internet that they had already kind of described it as being linked in that way?
The way it seems to have worked out is that there had already been a version of Tartaria conspiracy theory that was literally just there was a Tartarian empire that was floating around the Russian internet. And this is encountered by the mudflood people on the English language internet, and they kind of appropriate Tartaria as a dimension of mudflood / cultural layer. And it doesn't seem like that cross-pollinated back into the Russian discourse at all.
Oh, so that's very interesting. So first of all, what I'm getting is that this is an extremely modern sort of a conspiracy theory, which is always a very interesting thing to sort of pop up into, and one that's continually, as you mentioned, there are so many different details and variations of the myth. It's a conspiracy theory that is still being fleshed out, but about something that supposedly happened a long time ago. And it sounds like it's something that it's the people who are the major proponents today on the internet are not the people who started off particularly interested in the Tartaria aspect, but found that a kind of a convenient way to I hesitate to say substantiate, but just to add color, I guess, to their existing conspiracy theory. Is that an accurate conception of it, or is it more different or more complicated than that?
I mean, I'd say that's pretty fair. Simply put, Tartaria emerges out of cultural layer and not the reverse. You can see that in the nature of the communities involved. To use Reddit as an example, cultural layer has something like 48,000 subscribers. Tartaria has about 7,500. So like, it's a niche within this broader cultural layer conspiracy. But I think what's kind of interesting also is that like the reverse aspect is also that like Tartaria is something that emerges in Russia in a very specific way. I don't understand it particularly well because I don't read Russian, but someone did an entire PhD thesis on the broader conspiracy theory that created the Russian Tartaria conspiracy theory. Um, and that is the new chronology of Anatoly Fomenko, whom some listeners, if they are into historical conspiracies, may already know about. Um, like to tie this back to something you mentioned a little earlier, which is kind of the Soviet Union. The PhD thesis about Anatoly Fomenko and the new chronology, what it focuses on is the idea that Fomenko was trying to construct a new national myth for a post-Soviet Russia. And as part of that, he comes up with the idea that this region that is marked Tartaria on maps in early modern Europe was actually a country, but specifically, it was a country created by Russians. Like the Russians who had migrated, Slavs and Russians who had migrated eastward um, into places like Mongolia and Central Asia, and had then created their own empire. And that then the supposed Tartar yoke, when Russia, or what is now Russia, was ruled by the Mongols, and is seen as this dark age in Russian history, was in fact actually a region in which Russians were ruled by other Russians and it was all fine. And that actually what went wrong was that eventually the Russians got taken over by a German monarchy. It's a very specifically Russian nationalist theory that then gets massively garbled in translation, essentially, when it gets moved in conjunction with cultural layer.
So that's super interesting because now my first thought is so the conspiracy that you describe, and also, I took a quick look at the subreddit a while back, and I remember, there's definitely, like you said, it's relatively small and it's, English speaking and such, but then it seems to be the entirely separate sort of Tartaria, not necessarily a conspiracy theory in the same oddball kind of a way that we're used to, the English language one is, but it's like it seems that there are two kind of separate ones. To the best of your knowledge, what kinds of elements of the Russian one made it into the English language one, and where are some of the main divergence points, and do the current proponents on the internet and the English language internet use the Russian one continuously as a reference point, or is it just their starting point?
It is pretty much just the starting point. Like the only serious intersection is the idea of the existence of a Tartarian empire. I did actually have a trawl through at one stage the Tartaria subreddit, trying to find out what their views on Fomenko were, and the response to that seems to have been that They interpreted Fomenko as correct on the idea that Tartaria existed, but as having an overt Russian nationalist agenda, and that his interpretation of Tartaria is completely off. It's interesting in the sense that it is just the starting point. It doesn't really exert any further influence. Otherwise, the English language Tartaria Conspiracy is tied in with very different sorts of ideas.
So, what do you think drive the people who are interested in Tartaria? They're criticizing the Russian one for being Russian nationalist, and they have presumably their own lens on the matter. What do you think is bringing them into Tartaria? Just a general exposure to conspiracy theories, some other kind of ideology, or someone, just because they find it entertaining? What do you think motivates people to be interested in Tartaria, and how far do you think that kind of that the general interest in Tartaria has spread? So essentially, I was just wondering, what kinds of people make their way to the kinds of areas of the internet that discuss this, and how many of them do you think there are, and what do you think their reason is for being there?
Yeah, I would say that based on visible metrics, I'd put it at most in sort of low six-digit territory, like a 100,000, couple of 100,000, maybe, as far as I can tell, maximum. I think what's interesting with Tartaria is that it is it comes at the intersection of a number of conspiracy theories, because apparently it's also been infiltrating flat Earth conspiracy theorists these days as well. I don't know how. I just know that it is. So it feels like the audience for it is primarily just your generic conspiracy theorist-minded person. But how kind of the generic conspiracy theorist minded person comes about is interesting and possibly kind of above my pay grade in terms of my specialities. But I think one aspect of it that applies specifically to Tartaria for me is this idea that the internet has created a bit of a known unknown problem, to steal some Donald Rumsfeld. I think if you ask someone at random, and they were willing to respond to you, if they knew anything about the history of kind of Central Eurasia ever, they probably couldn't tell you anything because they probably hadn't even thought of it. They might know about the Mongols and that's it. What the internet has done, because it's made a lot of old texts that archaically use Tartaria, Tartary, etc. accessible, is that it's created a lot of, oh, there's a thing to know about, but also not given a very good answer to what the actual history is, which gives it a very good opening for people who are going to come up with conspiracy theories for how to fill the gap. Like, paradoxically, they know just enough to be sucked in by a conspiracy theory, which they wouldn't be if they didn't know anything at all. And I think the fact that the internet has made a lot of surface level material very accessible without really improving access to the deeper academic material, things like, because Central Asian history in recent years has been very well written on. That, I think, has been one of the major reasons why Tartaria has been able to prosper, on top of, I think, the more generic fact that a lot of people on the internet like conspiracy theories for reasons that I don't feel qualified to talk about at length, but relate in many ways to this kind of notion that they can do their own research better than anyone else has.
Definitely not something that's unique to that. And that's why I guess that leads sort of to my next question. And then I'd love to talk more about the content of, these discussions on the internet. But, I do Jewish history, and I feel like one of the things that pops up a lot is that if you dig deep enough into conspiracy theory, you'll end up with, anti-Semitism. This is definitely not, it's definitely not universally true, but it's just makes me think, when it comes to a conspiracy theory like this, if you dig deep far enough, do you see people making connections to more insidious kinds of conspiracy theories or more problematic kinds of conspiracy theories, especially when something concerns, an empire and it's based on a Russian one that has specifically to do with a Russian people, not specifically, Russian in this case, but just like a particular, I guess, ethnicity or particular group. Is this something where if you dig deep enough in the Tartaria conspiracy theory, which is popular among people who are generally interested in conspiracies, that you end up finding some of the more problematic ones?
Oh, absolutely. To be fair, I haven't yet, but may need to preserve my own sanity, encountered an overt kind of link from Tartaria to anti-Semitism, but I would genuinely be unsurprised to find it if I did. You will find several kinds of sort of racial nonsense in Tartaria. Not everywhere, but there are some old threads on places like r/Tartaria where people got very, very incensed over whether Tartarians were white or East Asian, which turned principally on interpretations of Herodotus's description of the Scythians in the early 5th century BCE. Like, a lot of it is very much grasping at straws, but that is the nature of racial conspiracy theories. The person who was insisting they were East Asian also happened to be the advocate of the idea that Catholicism is a global conspiracy, which is a thing that is not unheard of in some parts of the evangelical community in America. Jack Chick especially was infamous for this kind of thing. It's not that all conspiracy theories are believed by conspiracy theorists, but all conspiracy theories do fundamentally appeal to the same kinds of people, and usually people who subscribe to one will subscribe to others, and it does become a bit of a daisy chain to more serious things. I guess to insert a little bit of levity, to be fair, just because I do know about its existence, there was someone I encountered who claimed that Tartaria was a false flag conspiracy theory, and so was the idea of the global Jewish conspiracy, which I know you've been alluding to, because actually the world is run by the Phoenicians,
Mm.
which was wild. I don't think I can find it again, but I have never had my mind blown open quite so wide as the person saying that actually the global Jewish conspiracy is a false flag conspiracy for the real thing. Um, that was really a revelation as to how deep this rabbit hole goes.
Well, as long as they're, what's it called? They're paying us our checks from the, what's it called? From the protocol, the Elders of Zion. I don't really care who's the puppet master at the top. But essentially, I find that, first of all, if you ever do see that, that would be fascinating to see. I think that it's just very interesting because, the ways in which a conspiracy theory, can be, I guess, benign or interesting or just, something for someone to, a rabbit hole to go down and say, oh, wow, there are really people who think this. And then the ways in which these conspiracy theories can, end up intertwining with and become subsumed with things that are a lot more problematic and often, racist and different things like that. But on, I guess, a more, just a lighter, possibly note, or, just different note, I guess let's talk about the content. So you're saying that Tartaria is a largely internet based conspiracy. And so what are the people on the internet talking about on the different forums where they're discussing Tartaria?
So, there are a lot of things, but I think the most interesting has to do with architecture. To put it bluntly, Tartaria conspiracy theorists are fundamentally amazed by the idea that humans can build anything more elaborate than a mud shack. These conspiracy theories to do with cultural layer and more particularly with Tartaria, assert that you can see Tartarian architecture everywhere, basically as anything that has somewhat elaborate decoration and is more than about 3 stories tall, supposedly could only be built with Antiquitech or is a vessel for some kind of Antiquitech procedure. It doesn't matter if the buildings are at all stylistically similar. Like St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow is just as Tartarian as Angkor Wat in Cambodia, as the Chrysler Building in New York. You'll find, interestingly, that most of this is in North America and Europe and occasionally Asia, and very rarely in Africa and Oceania and South America. And I think part of how they try to explain that is the idea that the Tartarians colonized North America and controlled most of Europe, but not the rest of the world. But in short, there is that element to it. But there's also a really weirdly specific thing. And that is that, supposedly, one thing that characterizes Tartarian architecture is that it tends to involve very tall doors, especially on the ground floor. Now, we being sort of ordinary historians who have not opened our minds so wide that our brains fell out, we know that tall doors exist because they look cool and ostentatious. According to Tartaria conspiracy theorists, tall doors exist because Tartarians were literal giants. And so the proof of the scope of the Tartarian Empire is the distribution of buildings with tall doors for literal giants to walk through. That's kind of the biggest element of it. A sub-element is also the idea that they were supposedly gathering electricity from the air, and that's why buildings with elaborate decoration exist, as opposed to, looking nice. That's the reason why a lot of discussion around cultural layer in Tartaria revolves around buildings. Because there's this notion that Tartarians built buildings specifically intended for Tartarians, and the proof of that is that there are these features that can only, supposedly, be explained if the Tartarians were literal giants who could generate electricity out of thin air.
So this is all it sounds very sort of circular, where, you have the idea of Tartaria, as just a concept that has been adopted, I guess from Russia, from the Russian internet to the English language internet. You look around the world for examples, and then once you find those examples, it sounds like they're kind of building elements of this conspiracy sort of live. They find something that they think fits into Tartaria and then use that as a way to further explain what Tartaria is. Is that what's really going on? It's what it sounds like to me from how you're describing it.
Yeah, it looks like exactly that. Because when I first started looking into Tartaria in early 2020, there wasn't really the free electricity out of the air thing. But then they added it in because, actually, this all starts fitting. But you raised an interesting point, which is that it's quite meta as well, because Tartaria is in and of itself a circular thing that was absorbed into cultural layer. That, Tartaria is something that can be explained by cultural layer, and it is something that proves cultural layer, and it all goes round in circles from there. And similarly, all of these elements, like the weird architecture and the quote-unquote Antiquitech, that is all used as part of this. And it's all really tendentious stuff. People are looking everywhere to find any sort of building that doesn't look modernist, and is citing that as proof of some ancient globe-spanning civilization, because they don't fundamentally care about actual art and architectural history. It's only about, can we spin this as Tartarian? And because we can spin this as Tartarian, that reinforces the Tartaria theory in and of itself.
You mentioned the Chrysler Building earlier, and I don't know if it was just an example of an interesting looking building in North America or what, but what do they claim to be the latest point in which Tartaria had that kind of an influence and was building buildings? Where in history do they place the conspiracy? Where in history do they place the empire and its influence?
One thing that has popped up really recently, but seems to have firmly gained traction, is the idea that the these sort of World's Fair events that happen in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were actually ways for the new powers of the world, like the United States and Britain and Russia and France, to tear down Tartarian architecture by pretending it had been built for the World Fair. I can't. It is such a dumbfounding thing, but the one that they really like to harp on was the World's Columbian Exposition, which was held in Chicago in 1893. That photos of it show a lot of neoclassical architecture that they claim was Tartarian, and that they also claim was actually there before the World's Columbian Exposition, ever since the Tartarians turned up in North America. But that at some stage in the interim, the United States had established itself and taken over Chicago, and eventually went, how do we destroy the remnants of the Tartarian Empire? I know, how about we host a World's Fair and knock the buildings down by pretending that we built them for it? So to answer the question, around 1893, I guess?
That is just really very interesting. The idea that they're claiming that, I guess it's not just about Tartarian Empire existing, but it's about subsequent empires or cultures or countries specifically trying to destroy the evidence, which I guess builds into the conspiratorial mindset. And to put it mildly, grasping at straws to be able to do that, given the idea that something that was built and then destroyed a year later, as is clearly documented, could have been something that had been there for a really long time. That is extremely interesting. My next question was going to be, what are some of the crazier kinds of elements of the conspiracy theory that you've seen? You've already said one of them, I'm sure, unless there are even crazier ones that you would want to share.
My favourite is star forts. The word star fort should probably tell you what they do. They are forts. They are constructions designed to make it easy for whoever is inside to kill whoever is trying to come inside. Tartaria conspiracy theorists seem to be convinced that these complicated geometric structures are not complicated geometric structures because they were designed by people thinking about how long you can shoot a gun, and therefore what the most efficient way to design a structure for shooting guns out of is. But they are actually geomantic summoning devices for trying to do weird landscape engineering through magic. And this ties into mudfloods as being kind of, supposedly the Tartarians were building these star forts because they knew the mud flood was coming, and they were trying to do geomancy with the star forts to stop the mud flood, but it didn't work. I'm just going to let that sink in for a second.
I was gonna say, I'm not really sure how to respond to that. Also, the idea of sort of, you mentioned geomancy. I don't know if that's come up in this conversation previously, but is the idea that prior to the mud flood, they had some kind of magical powers over the earth or something like that?
Well, given that they have now started claiming that the Tartarians were extracting free electricity out of the air, looks like it. It does look like they are trying to claim that the Tartarians had access to these immense treasure troves of energy that modern humans have lost. Which, sure, whatever helps you sleep at night, I guess, but is just not possible to take credibly.
Would be good for the environment, though.
Wouldn't
But
it be great? Yeah. But I think if we're talking about Star Wars just a little more, I guess, because I think it just ties into, in a sense, how close they are and yet how far. Like, what makes Star Forts such gold for the Tartarian conspiracy theorists is that they do exist almost all over the world. Because there were globe-spanning empires, they were European empires, like the British and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch. who built star forts as mechanisms of controlling colonial territories, and I mean also in Europe as a means of controlling non-colonial territories, to be fair. But like, it's not that there weren't empires spanning the globe that built these things, but they were Western European maritime empires building them as mechanisms of military control, not this sort of magic wielding empire from Central Asia trying to stop a global mud flood.
It sounds a little bit like it's taking something that did exist in a way that sort of plays into actual history, like real things, and often things with like a lot of gravity to them to whatever degree, and sort of recasting them as something that's almost like it sounds weird, and but like more fun, like in a way, or more interesting to someone who doesn't necessarily want to like grapple with history, if that makes sense. I don't know whether that's potentially thinking too much into it or taking it a little too far, but it's just very interesting how these kinds of conspiracy things that are based on real, use real buildings and use real, it's sort of like a way of not thinking too much about what actually happened, but sort of casting it into something that sounds more interesting and that you have more control of the narrative over, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, we've touched occasionally on heavier stuff throughout, and I guess we ought at some point to segue into just a slightly more serious discussion about what Tartaria says about, both in a more specific sense, the people who advocate it, and the state of wider society in its understanding of history. But I mean, one of those dimensions is that, on some level, as noted, Tartaria is supposed to try and fill a gap in people's historical knowledge. Like, people genuinely do not know much actual history about Central Asia, and that makes it very easy for someone to come in with a wild theory that will convince people because they don't know any better. But that is also partly because, generally, history education in the Western world is focused on particular periods of the Western world that the people making school curricula consider to be definitive moments in, generally speaking, national histories. And that means that a lot of areas of the world, and I say a lot of areas of the world, pretty much any country that is not in Western Europe, North America, that sort of Atlantic region, tends to get put by the wayside. Um, you know, this isn't just about Central Asia, but also especially Africa, Oceania, indigenous histories of both North and South America. All of that gets pretty de-emphasized to begin with. And I think, while on the one hand Tartaria does have a somewhat perverse value in that it does remind people that history happens in other parts of the world, it would be very much preferable if it wasn't spreading lies about that history. But even at the same time, it is still trying to reframe that kind of Atlantic world history, or at least that kind of Western Civ history, in a conspiratorial frame. What's interesting is that it's not a nationalist conspiratorial frame, unless we're talking about the Russian version. But it is really interesting that it's, as far as I can tell, mostly young white guys, mostly in North America and some in the UK, trying to prove the existence of a vast Asian empire. And that's unusual, I guess, but I don't know that it's better in any meaningful sense.
What do you think is driving them towards that kind of specific type of conspiratorial mindset? Like you mentioned, it's a different kind of a conspiracy than if they, believed in, other, I don't know, I can't even think of a specific one at the top of my head, but like, the fact that it's Asian or Eurasian. What do you think is the significance of that?
I think there's two kinds of significance to it. One is, I think it's an interesting but possibly unconscious response to things like Ancient Aliens conspiracy theories, where the big iffy issue is that it's pretty much saying that non-white peoples can't build anything without aliens. The Tartaria conspiracy theory really weirdly suggests that humans are capable of building much more complicated stuff than we thought, other than we think, rather, and that the specific humans to do it are people from a region that, for most of world history, or most of actual world history, has been considered like the epitome of quote unquote barbarian, savage lifestyles. Um, but I think the other element is also that there's just a certain desire for the world to be more complicated in ways that can specifically be discovered by an individual with access to Google Books. Not to read too deep into it is possibly in some ways correct, in that it's a lot of people who want to feel good about discovering something that no one else knows about. For some, there is a very obvious ethnic dimension to it, that they are trying to prove some complex nonsense about racial hierarchies or global Catholic conspiracies or, I don't know, Phoenician influence in global politics. But for some, I think it's as simple as, oh, hey, I found this thing that I'm right about and everyone else has historically been wrong about, and I can feel smug. Or maybe not even necessarily smug. I can feel proud to have stumbled upon the great truth. And I think the dangerous thing about that is the people who are naively thinking they're stumbling onto the truth, then coming down into the pipeline to stuff like anti-Semitic conspiracies that other people in those kinds of communities advocate.
You mentioned encountering it, starting seeing indications from 2017, but personally encountering it in 2020. Obviously, COVID itself brought in lots of the element of people wanting to discover things for themselves and trusting things more, that they found themselves, and having a vast ecosystem of sketchy internet on which to do that. I guess my next question is, first of all, like, what made you interested in Tartaria, and just in a more general sense, and led to you diving deeper into it, and then what has your experience been, sort of as you're describing it, watching a conspiracy theory, grow and change and mutate every day, as you're following, or however often, you're following each individual thing that you're on. What's it been like over the last couple of years watching this conspiracy theory mutate?
Yeah, I mean, to reassure people, there was a time when I was checking Tartaria daily. Now I just do it once every 1 or 2 months at most, just to see what the latest nonsense has been. So I got interested in looking into Tartaria, mostly because I happened to be doing a university module at the time, an undergraduate history module on Eurasian history in the early modern period, which is literally the period that Tartaria discusses. So I don't even know how specifically I stumbled on it, but it just so happened that I stumbled on it at a time when I was doing sort of relatively serious academic level learning on the actual history of that period. So it became a thing where I was looking at it from the perspective of, what is their supposed evidence and why is it flimsy? And that led to me doing this huge long form post about specifically just the historical element. So nothing about the star forts or the buildings, just what is the supposed evidence. What kept me looking, I think, was the realization that there were all of these little auxiliary elements to it. And I was just so curious as to what it was all trying to lead up to. So at one stage, I did use an alt account, an alt burner account, to post deliberately stupid questions to see how they'd respond. And I realized that no matter how deliberately stupid I was, I would get even more insane responses. The biggest one was one in which I had encountered this claim that the so-called Tartarian flag, which, like, there are a couple of charts from the late 18th and early 19th centuries that supposedly depict a flag of Tartary. What it is kind of unclear. Candidates range from it being a reproduction of the flag of the Khanate of Kazan, um, or alternatively, the flag of the Qing Empire in China, because that was founded by the Manchus, whom the Europeans also referred to as Tartars. Anyway, there was this claim that because that had a dragon on it, and the flag of Wales had a dragon on it, there must have been some connection between Tartaria and Wales.
Naturally.
And so I thought, okay, what if I bring up Stonehenge? Like, what if Stonehenge was built by Welsh giants, and in turn, what happened to the giant Welsh people? And I received several responses telling me, no, actually, Stonehenge was built in 1957. And that was pretty much the last joke question I ever posted to our Tartaria, because where do you go from there? How what possibly can you do once someone has told you that actually Stonehenge was built in the 1950s?
So was this two people or multiple people who said the same thing about it being built in 1957? So this is a discussion that they've been having elsewhere and they've come to an agreement on?
It was one person who got very heavily upvoted and saw other comments saying, I agree with this.
Oh, see, it's funny because my next question had kind of been, so what percentage of people on, anonymous forums do you think are, I guess, for lack of a better word, shit posters? And to what extent do you think that really matters if, there are also going to be the actual, provably conspiracy-minded people who are going to latch onto these kinds of things? But it definitely sounds like either way, there is a large, ecosystem of people who, whether or not this is a thing that they personally, it's an idea that they personally had, they will jump onto it. And even if there were zero, shit posters, the kinds of thing would still build upon itself.
Yeah, I think what's been interesting is the ways in which cultural layer more generally, and in turn Tartaria more specifically, have involved so much of someone has this idea or encounters this idea from somewhere else, brings it up, and then everyone looks at that and goes, yeah, that makes sense. It's not that there is no pushback to ideas on Tartaria, but very rarely is there an entirely novel idea that a majority of people overtly choose to disagree with. It does seem like any addition to the picture is a good addition.
Yeah, so it's just, do you think that there are other people besides you on there who are there, because they're fascinated by the phenomenon versus, because they're actually believers? Or do you think that question isn't actually, it is or isn't actually like a relevant question?
I know that for sure. I had a DM conversation with someone who, for a while, was on Tartaria primarily as a debunker. It's not that there are, I think, definitely plenty of people who follow various conspiracy theories specifically because it is either their intent to debunk them or because they find it amusing to see what they come up with. These days I'm in the latter camp because I don't have the energy to just write full-length debunks anymore and get into arguments. But it's definitely not just serious believers. There are people who will use alt accounts and such to follow conspiracy theories out of either curiosity or a hope that they can pull some people out.
So I guess my question now is there anything that you were kind of hoping I would ask or thought would be, something interesting to say? I just didn't give you, I guess, an opportunity to go into it. Any final closing remarks that you would want to make about Tartaria and why you think that this is something that people will find relevant or interesting or should come away from this episode thinking about?
I would say I think we've been pretty comprehensive, but I guess to kind of make a statement that ties together a lot of the things we've discussed, I think Tartaria is, in the most neutral sense, interesting in that it exposes a lot of issues with the nature of knowledge on the internet and of the limitations of historical education in the contemporary West. Simply put, it creates a problem and sells a solution, so to speak, in that it creates the problem that you don't actually know anything about the history of Central Asia, do you? Well, let me tell you. And actually, as it turns out, it also tells you a lot about the history of Southeast Asia and North America and so on. As a kind of the initial impulse then becomes a gateway drug to lots of other madness. But I think the problem is not one that Tartaria created. It kind of creates a problem within a wider problem space of the fact that historical awareness about a lot of periods and places is very poor. I don't think there is a perfect solution to this, because trying to cover all of global history, even in someone's school years, is never going to produce a particularly good appreciation of it. But I think what can potentially be improved is the basic idea of historical literacy and understanding how history works. And I think that's part of also why Tartaria has been successful, because it relies on very shoddy methodology. If there were a wider appreciation of how historical knowledge is generated, that would, I think, be a significant damper to it. And that's, if we want to kind of make a really self-congratulatory point, kind of what Ask Historians is about, which is not just spreading historical knowledge in and of itself, but also an understanding of how we come to have that knowledge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Definitely examining sometimes I think one thing that comes to mind about that is, sort of like when we examine like the premise of a question or different things like that, have, methods kinds of posts, definitely people, I guess, when it comes to the borderline between, like you were saying earlier, having access to so much knowledge on the internet versus having a framework to be able to say, oh, look, this is interesting, we're talking about Asia, and I don't know much about Asia, versus, oh, this is interesting, we're talking about Asia, I don't know much about Asia, so I will immediately believe the most conspiratorial angle. And again, I would definitely always good to kind of, I guess, reflect on the ways that, we as a, internet community can work against those kinds of instincts that people will have, or help give people the tools to unpack things better in a way that comports more with what actually happened, if you want to put it on the most basic level. But thank you so much, Jeremy. That was very interesting and, of course, went in directions I wasn't expecting. And thank you, everyone, for listening to our April Fool's podcast episode. I hope that despite, it not being on an actual historical phenomenon, you were, as we were discussing, able to learn a little bit more about what exactly we are trying to avoid and what kinds of conspiratorial mindsets can distort history and what actually happened.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.